Welcome back to the You Can Too podcast. On today's show, we have Seth Godin. Seth is the author of 21 international bestsellers that have been translated into 38 different languages. We have Lynchpin, The Purple Cow, The Dip, This Is Marketing, so many more. I got this Tribe's right next to me. He writes one of the most popular marketing blogs in the world, and he's done so much more in this world. But I'm really excited to talk about his new book, Song of Significance, a new manifesto for teams. Seth, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for doing this. Thank you for showing up. I know you got lots of other choices, but you are sharing generously, and that matters. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I know that you only write when you have no choice. When did that happen for this book and your past books? When do you know, when you blatantly know that you have no choice?
Well, it didn't used to be that way. I was a book packager. I did 120 books, and then as an author, I probably made it through 10 books where I persuaded myself that my job was to write books. What happens to you after a while is you realize that writing can take many forms. And if you want to reach a lot of people, a book is probably not the best way to do it because books don't spread the way videos or podcasts or blog posts do. And so I announced quite famously that I was done publishing books and then had to be a hypocrite and change my mind. And it's usually because something about an idea demands a deeper conversation. First, a deeper conversation by me in talking to the book itself, and then a conversation between and among us, because a book is a totem, a symbol. It stands for something. So in this case, the whole world just went through a worldwide pandemic. Many of us lost people we care a lot about. At the same time, it's a miracle that people were willing and able to work from home, and the economy hardly missed a beat. I'm guessing when the Spanish flu killed millions of people around the world, that wasn't true. And then we got quiet quitting, and we've got billionaires firing disabled people online for fun, just for kicks. We've got people cheering for the kind of dominance of industrial capitalism that we all grew up in. And it just felt to me like there was a lot to say. And so here's a book.
Where did that start for you? What was the prompt for you that made you? I mean, we can jump into the Song of Significance. We can jump into the Song of Increase. There's the bees. We can talk about so much here. Where would you like to start?
Well, I'm here for you. I mean, the proximate cause was the bees and learning about Jacqueline Freeman's work and an adventure I had on the West Coast. But I think even if that hadn't happened, something was brewing inside of me that I wanted to share. But I'm fascinated by the bees. I got my little bee mug here and everything. So who knows?
What makes the best job ever?
So you haven't had that many jobs, I'm guessing.
Not really.
But most people, if I ask them, what's the best job you ever had? They have an answer. I've never met anyone who didn't have an answer. It's like, tell me about your first date or something.
Mhm.
So if we all know what the best job we ever had was, and we all imagine that in that job, something special happened, why aren't we trying to build that again? Why isn't the dynamic of management or leadership or capitalism or anything built around the idea that if we assemble people and offer them the best job they ever had, something great may very well come out of it? And so I asked 10,000 people in 90 countries, what's the best job you ever had? And the research showed up the same answers over and over again. Now, if you ask bosses what they think is important, they will tell you pay people a lot, don't fire them, don't make them work too hard. Those are the three things that they talk about. None of those three things showed up in the top 10. The things that showed up were I accomplished more than I thought I could. People treated me with respect. I did work that matters. And yet bosses are doing nothing to create those conditions.
Where do you think we can have a increase in leverage within ourselves to start creating more leverage for ourselves to create a life that we actually, we do like waking up to every day?
Well, now this is a great question. Um, because the worst boss you ever had, for sure, is you.
Yep.
He calls you in the middle of the night and wakes you up. He bothers you about things that aren't quite finished yet. He hassles you about your competence. He makes you work too hard. He bothers you on the weekend. That's the voice in our head. That's the
Mhm.
worst boss. So if you could hire yourself a better boss, a whole bunch of things are going to improve. And part of it is being willing to look at that boss who actually gives us a salary and say, nah, not interested. Because if we settle, that's what we're going to get.
Do you think it starts with developing real skills for ourselves? Like what are skills to begin with in your opinion?
So people who are still in school or looking for a job are drilled into this idea of more hard skills. And the hard skills are how fast can you type? Do you know PHP? Can you make a server run? Do you show up, with your calculator ready to go?
Yeah.
But those are all easily outsourced. AI is going to do most of those. If you're a mediocre writer, we don't need you anymore.
Yeah.
Real skills are sometimes called soft skills. Real skills are honesty and integrity and loyalty and creativity and a sense of humor and initiative and asking hard questions. And we can go down a list of things that don't feel like skills at all.
Yeah.
But they're all skills because you can get better at them. And if you can get better at them, that's sort of the definition of a skill.
Throughout your period of time within this space, it's been a long time and you've just done so much. What's something that you've changed your mind about from when you started to where you are today?
Oh, I have changed my mind about way more things probably than I have kept it. I was a very vocal proponent for homework for a long time. I felt like more homework made better students. I was wrong about my unbridled optimism about what would happen to humanity when we got online and we gave everybody a microphone.
Mm-hmm.
I was wrong about the self restraint of the people who were building the internet, believing that they would build something they were proud of as opposed to building something that manipulated us at
Yeah.
our expense so that they could make more money. I was wrong about how some ideas seem universal, but in fact, everyone's got a different story. And some people are just as happy tearing something down as building something up.
Knowing that you said, the skills that you mentioned are skills that we don't think of as skills. What skill do you wish you developed earlier?
Well, regret is an interesting thing. All the mistakes I've made, and there are a ton of them, I wouldn't trade in at all because that allowed me to get to where I am.
Of course.
But I am way more patient now than I used to be. And I used to view my impatience as an asset
Ambition.
because I shipped more stuff,
Yeah.
but it's not. There are ways that you can be eagerly generous and driven to do your work, but still be patient.
What does that look like? Because I think in entrepreneurship to begin with, we're always grinding. We're always going to the next thing. We always want to release the next thing. And we're looking 20 years in the future. I know for me, I'm looking 20 years in the future. I want to be where you are right now. And I'm just getting started. What does that relationship look like?
So if you watch a not very good stand up comic, they will rush the punchline
Mm.
because they don't have the confidence to sit with the tension. And the best comics hold it the right amount of time. And part of it is figuring out when to speak up, even when the audience might not be ready. And so for entrepreneurs, what we're in a hurry to do is make an impact. We don't have to be in a hurry to fill every empty space. That often the shortest route is one that goes over bridges, not the one that has to plow through a wall.
And throughout your period of time, like when did that become prominent for you to recognize that? Because 21 international bestsellers, like you've been at it for a while. I'm curious when that relationship shifted for you, for yourself.
So when I started Yo-Yo which was one of the very first internet companies,
Yep.
it was funded by Jerry Colonna and Fred Wilson, two of the greatest VCs of all time. I was their first joint investment. And this was before all the silly internet hype of unicorns and that nonsense. But I viewed every one of those pennies as my pennies. And I was very careful and very high speed in how we were going to get out from under all that equity, how we were going to honor the investment that people had made. And as a result, we built a profitable company faster than almost any other internet company turned profit. But we left a lot on the table because we weren't willing to let the market catch up with us. And that shift to an abundance mindset away from scarcity toward educating, building the culture, figuring out how things are around here. I wouldn't trade one of those minutes at Yodai, but if you saw me in those days, you would need some sleeping pills just to take the edge off. I was going very fast.
I believe it, and to this day, it still can almost seem that way from an external perspective, right? And I want to dive into that abundance versus scarcity, because I think, especially when you grow up not really seeing much abundance around you, you almost see it's like it's not possible. And this is a big reason I made the podcast, was I want to help people unlearn these beliefs that we're not really conscious enough of to recognize that they're blocking us from achieving so much more. When did that shift happen for you?
Well, I had great parents, but I think that my experience in many of these things isn't really important. I really care a lot about the listener's experience in those things.
Yeah.
So, I've been to small villages in India where there's no electricity. And the typical young person from any part of the United States, no matter how well off or not well off, planted there, would be bereft after 3 hours. I mean, at 6 o'clock at night, it's pitch black and it's silent, and it stays that way until 8 o'clock in the morning. And yet, the people who I was hanging out with weren't feeling scarcity. They were feeling abundance, because abundance comes from connection and community. And what happens when someone else sees you? What happens when they treat you with respect? That part of the problem of modern marketing is it's persuaded generations of teenagers to believe they don't have enough. That's how they sell you stuff.
Yeah.
When modern marketing started, not modern marketing, mass marketing started 100 years ago, the average teenager in the United States had 2 pairs of pants and 2 pairs of shoes. And there was no Kohl's and there was no Walmart. They have to create scarcity in your head in order to get you to buy more stuff.
So throughout your experience, was there ever a moment in time where you lacked the belief that you could do something, whether it's from a book or from early on in your journey through marketing or anything in that regard?
Well, I think you're asking about 2 different kinds of could do something. There's the can Seth dunk a basketball? And the answer is no. Can Seth juggle 5 balls? The answer is not yet.
Right.
But I could learn. And if the question is, could Seth have a show on Netflix? The answer is, it's not up to me. And those are 3 different questions. I think we should be honest with ourselves about the first category, the things that you are physically you can't go to Mars and come back. You just can't. The second one is the one that opens the door to learning, because you can be enrolled in the journey to control things you can control. And then the third one is about, can you create the conditions where other people want to dance with you? And, so if we think about this podcast of yours, you can't make Michelle Obama listen to the podcast, but there's nothing stopping you from making the podcast better every episode. And if you could do that long enough, it's entirely possible she could listen to your podcast.
Absolutely. What's an insight that you truly believe in that you maybe think some people haven't thought too much about?
Well, you tell me yours.
I think for me, it is the fact that that our mind is truth. Like the thoughts that we have are automatically concrete. I think for a lot of people, we don't think about our thoughts enough to recognize, like, we often project the worst possible outcome, for example.
Thinking about thinking, metacognition. Yeah. I did a blog post the other day about the little man or person inside of us who's behind the controls, the one that talks to us, the one that says, when we're say, I'm talking to myself, well, who is I in that sentence? And the one that we're now giving over to AI and imagining that AI has a little person inside. And people were surprised that I said, nobody has a little person inside of them. We are code. AI is code. It's code all the way down. So if you don't like what your code is producing, then you should put yourself in situations where you get new code. And that's who are your heroes, who are your enemies, who is influencing you, who are you looking up to, who are you spending time with, what are you reading? We're plastic. We can recode that.
I think there's a belief that this idea of perfectionism, for example, is something that a lot of people struggle with. And I think knowing that you've just released so much over the years, you've made it a habit, it's a part of who you are. There's no question around it now. When do you decide it's good enough? And how can more people recognize that for themselves so they can start launching and stop thinking?
Okay, so let's break down the words because they matter a lot.
Mhm.
Perfectionism has absolutely nothing to do with perfect. That the Bureau of Weights and Measures keeps a perfect sphere and a brick that weighs exactly a kilo, except it's not a perfect sphere and it doesn't weigh exactly a kilo. That nothing is actually perfect ever. Perfectionism is simply a culturally appropriate excuse to hide from responsibility. Because if you say, I'm a perfectionist, you expect people to admire you for that. But that's not what good enough means. The definition of good enough is it is good enough. If good enough isn't good enough, then redefine it so that it is. But once you've reached that threshold, then by definition, you have achieved what Demings would call quality. Quality means meeting spec, does not mean perfect. If you took the best quality car made in the world, last time I checked, it was a Lexus, which is, to a tenth of a micron or whatever it is, perfect. There isn't one part of that car that's not defective, but they ship it anyway because it meets spec. If you want to raise the spec, please do. But I can tell you that I have blog posts with typos in them. It doesn't seem to make a difference. I did a book, and I'm embarrassed to say that the Mahatma's name was spelled wrong. I got 2 letters in Gandhi mixed up. I'm still proud of the book. And
Yeah.
how much more time should the team have spent to catch that typo? The typo didn't have an impact on whether the book worked or not. So, no, we don't ship junk, but we have to adequately name the spec. If you don't have a spec and you say you're just holding back for better, then you're hiding. And you should say that. You should say, I'm afraid to ship this, not I'm a perfectionist.
Absolutely. And I think the same thing when it comes to, I love your idea on imposter syndrome. I'm in full support of that. And I'd love to hear what your perspective is on imposter syndrome, because I think for a lot of people, it's just like perfectionism. We're trying to stay back, we're trying to stay comfortable. But in reality, I see it as a sign that it's a good thing. If I'm not feeling imposter syndrome, like right now, like if I'm not feeling imposter syndrome, I would not be growing. I would not be getting better. I would not be moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. Imposter syndrome, a lot of people will tell you how to get rid of that feeling. And I'm going to tell you, you don't want to get rid of that feeling. That feeling is a symptom. The same way, if you're tired when you're running a marathon, that means you're probably doing it properly. And the reason you feel like an imposter is you are one. You are one because you've never done this before. You can't prove that you know. Like, so I've never done a podcast with James before. And so I'm pretending I know how to do my half, but I've never had these questions before. So I'm
Mhm.
impostering my way to better.
Absolutely. Knowing that, I want to jump into the book a little bit here. And I think there's a part of it where management and leadership they're not in alignment. And I think a lot of people do see them as one. Where do you think the difference between them is?
Well, I mean, the words matter again. So we call someone a manager because they have power and authority. They're
Mhm.
higher up in some org chart. They get to tell us what to do and they can punish us if we don't. That is not at all related to leadership. Leadership is voluntary. Leadership is we're not sure. Leadership is we're going over there. Who wants to come? If people aren't following you voluntarily, then you're managing them. And that's fine. We need managers. Fast food restaurants need managers. Airlines need managers. But if you want to do something with meaning, something significant, then you are leading, regardless of your title, regardless of your power. And so, what I would challenge people to do is begin by saying, are you having a conversation right now as a leader, or are you telling me what to do as a manager?
Where do you think, I think there's a point where we have to become the leader of ourselves before we can become a leader of anyone else. And where do you think that, I think standards come in when it comes, for me at least, my standards is what I idea is of success. If I'm doing what I said I was going to do, I'm succeeding in life, really. Where do you think the difference is between standards and obedience?
Okay, so I'm hearing two different things there. The first one is leading ourselves.
Hmm.
We get back to that little man thing, but
Yeah.
enrollment is what matters. You always do better at something if you want to do it. And if you are dragging your feet because you have to do something, you need to think about a couple of things. One, could you be doing something else where you weren't dragging your feet? And two, is the thing you're doing, would it work better if you pretended you were enrolled? If you pretended that this is what you want to do? Because after all, in a free world, whatever you are doing is exactly what you decided to do, because you don't have to do it. You could go work somewhere else. You have to work somewhere, but you're working here. Since you've decided to do this, are you enrolled? And then standards versus obedience. If you want to make a car that gets closer to spec, you don't do that by saying, I'm the boss, do what I say. You do that by saying, this is the current spec. Here are the variables. What can we do to make each variable go up? You're allowed to have high standards. You're allowed to say, you need to remake this to spec. That is different than criticizing the worker. That is different than saying you're a bad person. What we're saying is we need everything to get better, and we're going to get it better by being clear about the spec and telling each other the truth.
Was just going to ask what the difference would be into criticizing the work instead of criticizing the worker, because I think again, back to entrepreneurship, I think it's a tough thing when you are your own leader. You are your that voice in your head almost, and it's like, how do you find that balance between always striving? And I ask this very, very often, is like, what's the difference, or how do you find the balance even between striving and surrendering? Right? We don't want to be in a rush, but we also don't want to let ourselves off the hook.
I think it's up to the user, not the producer,
Mm.
right? So if somebody needs my help and I can offer them help, but the files aren't in alphabetical order, I'm still helping them and they're grateful. On the other hand, if I'm shipping junk, I'm not helping them. That's what I came to do. So we've got to think deeply about who's it for and what's it for. What is the change we seek to make?
What is significance?
Once again, I'll ask you now. What do you think significance is?
I think it's having meaning and a purpose. I think it's waking up knowing that what you're doing is leading to a bigger purpose tomorrow, the next day.
I agree. And the symptom for me is there has to be a change. If you're
Mhm.
not making a change happen, it's hard for me to see where the significance lies, where the meaning lies. So if we're here to make a change, let's be clear. Who's it for and what's it for? So your podcast might be just to change you, and you don't care if anyone listens to it. It might be to change the kind of person you're imagining is listening to it. And if they don't change, then maybe you should stop making the podcast because you didn't make the change you sought. Or maybe you should make it a different way. But my guess is this far into it, you are hearing from people that you've made an impact on. And so you keep doing it because you are finding meaning in that practice.
Absolutely. I'm going to continue to reiterate this, but you've been in this space for a long time, and I think it's important to take away, extract as much as I can. What are some standout characteristics of high performers, whether you see within yourself or people you've worked with, or you just believe in the world, that stand out for you?
I don't think it's what many people would say. I think it's agreeableness
Mm.
and uh, commitment and generosity. That there are plenty of people who have none of those three elements who are famous. I know some of them. Almost every billionaire I know doesn't have all three of those things. And so if you want to be a billionaire, you want to be famous, you might not need those things. But to build a resilient life of meaning, I find that when those people show up in the room, good things tend to happen.
Are there any standout unifying things that show up for creative people? I mean, you are the definition of creativity, like
Oh, you're very kind. You
truthfully.
know, a lot of creative people are a little broken. And one way they deal with whatever piece of pottery inside needs mending is by shipping work that has some kind of beauty to it, putting something in the world that beyond their physical presence causes a change to happen. And the definition of creativity keeps changing. And GPT makes that even more likely that it's going to keep changing. If all we're doing is randomly putting things together, we got a computer who can do that cheaper. That what it means to be creative in any field is being very comfortable with doing things that might not work and also being comfortable with them being generous things. If you can do those two things, Herbie Hancock's autobiography is fantastic. Herbie made more than 50 records. Half of them are below average. Some of them are clunkers. But no one knew before they came out which ones were which. And, he won a Grammy and Video of the Year for a song
Hmm.
called Rocket. And his record label at first refused to release it because they said they couldn't sell any of it, didn't fit into the right boxes. So part of Herbie's work was making the song in the first place. But the other part of Herbie's work was caring enough about the generous act of publishing it that he was willing to have a showdown to get it into the world.
Yeah. Was there something that you created that turned out better than you thought it would? I bet you there's probably a lot of things, I would assume.
So part of my shtick is in my dreams, the things I'm creating are really shiny and effective. So I'm okay with the fact that almost every time they don't come out as well as I thought they would, because I know that my method is to visualize them being even better, cooler than they are. When have I been pleasantly surprised and delighted? I would say this. I gave one of the TED Talks that were recorded before anyone knew they were being recorded,
Hmm.
before they were on the internet. And so I thought only 250 people saw my TED Talk. And it was at least 5 years later before
Yeah.
my first TED Talk was online. And I watched that person who gave the talk, who I hardly remembered. And I thought that was better than I remembered it.
Yeah. What's something that we don't really prioritize when we're young, but we neglect or we wish we did when we get older? Something that maybe for you that this is probably more specified, but would love to hear.
I'm not sure it's going to work if I say it, but I think there's a lot to be said for going for a walk. I think there's a lot to be said for saying things that you are afraid to say because you could say them later. And taking the time to say those things now, to clear the air, to share how you're really feeling, to be thankful. You don't get a chance to do it later. And it's worth it.
Grateful for that. And I if you've seen my Instagram, I pretty much do every single day on my story. I say go on a walk. It's been one of the most prolific things that I've done since I was so young. Didn't realize how big of an impact it would have on my life, and now I do it literally every single day.
That's fantastic.
It is, and I do my best to be without headphones, without anything in that regard, because that's when you really get to talk to that guy in your head, and that's the most prolific. Has there been any other exercise? I know meditations have been really, really big for me. Is there anything else that you do, whether it's to get more creative or to just really build your relationship with yourself that you've done?
Well, I'll give you one from Neil Gaiman, who's way more creative and successful than me. Uh, Neil doesn't believe in writer's block, and neither do I.
Hmm.
But when Neil is behind, he locks himself in a cabin with absolutely nothing to do. There's just paper. That's it. If he gets bored enough, he will entertain himself by writing something down. And in my case, if there isn't a project, there's going to be a project. The trap is to feed social media and imagine that all you need to do is the next episode of whatever.
Yeah.
So I got, I haven't made an episode of Akimbo in over a year because after 250 episodes, it was enough. And doing an episode a week made me feel like I was being creative. By doing none of that, all of a sudden something occurs that wouldn't have been there if I had been busy.
Mm. What are, and this doesn't have to be specifically about you, but maybe it's something that you've seen as well, but what are like the less obvious reasons that whether it's you or someone that you've seen have found success? Because I think the act of publishing and doing everything in that regard, you've mastered that. But what are some less obvious reasons that maybe aren't so surface level?
I'm flattered that you have called me successful, but many people who are actually successful by most measures in book publishing would not look at my output as successful. And by redefining what I get as success, it's much easier for me to feel successful. And so if I write a blog post and I hear from 5 people, that's a successful blog post. I'm not keeping track of did I show up on Reddit or did I win the internet today, because that's out of my control. What is in my control is some people are going to give me the benefit of the doubt, and a few of them might be changed by what I did. And what I see is that the happiest creatives I know, that's what we all do. We are not saying, I am depending on some random event to make me happy. They're saying, my job is to chop this wood and carry this water for these people to see if I can make a difference. And then if I'm lucky, I get to do it again tomorrow.
The purpose, you've reached that. It's that's the number one thing every single day. And I think a question that I like to reflect on a lot is what's the cost of inaction? And it, because it puts it into perspective, like you said earlier, is like we're going to get to the end of our life regretting a lot of the things that we didn't do rather than the things that we did do. And I think the quality of our questions direct the quality of our life. And a question that I like to ask is, if you could have a question on your bedside table, you had to read it every single morning, what would that question be?
I'm hesitant to go all guilt here and pushing anyone, including myself, every morning with some sort of haranguing voice of, did you do enough? Did you care enough? Did you connect enough? Did you ship something today?
Mm-hmm.
Because that creates a scarcity mindset again, right? Um, maybe my answer is more meta than that. Maybe my question is, what's the question? I think if we can get our arms around today's question, it might make it more likely that we are generative in finding an answer.
I think I often reflect on, like, I have reminders on my phone where a question will pop up in the middle of the day. It'll make me think, make me remind myself I need to be conscious of the things that I'm doing throughout my day. Was there something that you felt that you failed at before that you've now learned that was really powerful and it wasn't really a failure?
Well, first, I would encourage you to think about whether you can come up with 365 of those questions, and maybe do your next project could be a page-a-day calendar with James's 365 questions worth thinking about.
I will.
I would say just about every single commercial failure I have had wasn't a failure at all. It taught me what I needed to go to the next thing. I would say that every personal failure I've had in engaging with other people, where I have set bad expectations or let them down or transgressed in some way, those failures are real.
Yeah. I think, and you talk about this in your book, and I want to dive into it because I think for a lot of people, we have these misguided judgments about what we think people want in the world, their dreams, their successes. Where do you think we go wrong when it comes to that?
Well, Sonder is the realization that other people have a noise in their head. like you have a noise in your head.
Hmm.
And it was a huge insight for me when I realized that. People don't want what you want. They don't see what you see. They don't believe what you believe. And you have to be able to say that's okay. Because if you need everyone to change their mind to deal with you, you're going to be waiting a very long time. We need to find people who already believe what we need them to believe, to help them, to dance with them, to serve them. And then we need to eagerly embrace the people who don't believe that stuff, because their experience is different than ours. They grew up differently than us. They have different fears and different dreams than we do.
Yeah. Why do you think we need significance in our lives?
I thought a lot about this from an evolutionary biology perspective. I have no doubt that hope is hardwired, and spirituality came from our desire for hope. And then
Hmm.
religion was buckled on top of that. And right next to hope, it seems to me, is a feeling that we actually have agency and that we actually can do something about the things we hope for. So, hope probably gets us to meaning, and meaning, I think, gets us to a desire for significance. And just about everyone I've ever read, even if they are paralyzed in fear, still wants, dreams, hopes for meaning.
Where do you think most people go wrong when it comes to creating a life that they do feel very significant in every single day?
I don't know if it's possible to feel significant every single day.
Of course.
I think that a big part of it is the story we tell ourselves. There are people who, they're number 5 on TikTok today and they're sad because they're not number 1. That's just crazy,
Yeah.
right? That if we're constantly focused on revenge and who's ahead of us on the run, we can't do anything. That the New York City Marathon gets tens of thousands of people and every single one but 4 loses. But yet people run the marathon because they're not there to win the race. They're there to do the race. And so if you're creating value for someone you seek to serve, you are winning, you are creating significance. And then we have to decide, is the story we are telling ourselves helping?
When did that process of thought even come in for you? Like the idea of the story that you told yourself, and how were you able to shape that through your extensive experience in this work?
I think it's available to everybody, and everyone's going to find it someplace else. And if I said, go read this book or go do that course, it's not going to work for most people.
Hmm.
Just knowing it is there is the key. That sooner or later, provided you're not traumatized by the world, provided you're not being physically or emotionally abused, people will come to the conclusion that they either need to work on their story or settle. And when we work on our story, it gives us the chance, as we talked about when we started this conversation, to lead. And leadership is that exploration of the liminal space between here and there, the doing the things that might not work. And Lord knows the baby boomers made a huge mess. And we're asking people like you, unfortunately, to clean it up. And that's only going to happen when people like you show up and do things that might not work.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there's a point you talk about this in your book as well. How do we avoid false proxies?
I can talk about false proxies for 6 hours.
I'll do
So
it.
as we seek to wrap this up, I guess what I would say is we need to judge a book by its cover because you're not allowed to read the book before you buy it. We need to judge the ketchup by the cover because you can't taste the ketchup before you leave the store.
Mhm.
So we're understandably connected to labels. The problem is, in a shifting world, at work, the labels get in the way. They lead to caste systems. They lead to prejudice. They lead to misogyny. They lead to us hiring people who look like us or are good at interviewing, as opposed to finding people who are good at actually doing the work to be done. And the most important thing we can do is name it. And then the second most important thing we can do is find actual proxies and believe, once we test them, that we can commit to them. And in Moneyball, Michael Lewis talked about how this can help you independent. But It works when they make brownies down the street at the Greyston Bakery, and it works in just about any successful organization. We need to find people who are enrolled in the journey and who are capable of putting in the real skills to get it done, not judging people by things based on power and affiliation, because those are a trap.
Absolutely. There's one question I ask every guest, is last question. Encapsulates what I'm trying to do with this podcast. What belief are you currently unlearning?
I think it's going to take a long time to unlearn the belief of the worldwide caste and capital system that we all grew up with, judging people by metrics based on their genetics, by their background, or by how much money they have. Who should we give the benefit of the doubt to? Why is it that somebody who won one lottery gets credit in another lottery? And if we're honest with ourselves, that's going on all the time. And it gets in the way of so many things that are important.
Absolutely. Seth, thank you so much for coming on the show. I can't express my gratitude enough.
Keep making a ruckus. I'm glad to talk
Thank
to
you.
you.